All right. Hello, Chapter 8, Wednesday. I always rub my hands. Getting warmed up for the music. First on the hit parade this morning is Sly and the Family Stone. Amazing band. In fact, from the album cover project, I held that album. It had stars and stripes all over it, and then you open it up and there's a band playing live, and I said, you don't know who that is. It's Sly and the Family Stone. That's them. So if you've got your Spotify list pulled up, give a listen. Sly and the Family Stone, amazing funk band, and they took a lot of influence from James Brown, and they would become key influencers of George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic and Rick James and Prince. They all owe a nod to Sly and the Family Stone's way. So first off, one of their big early hits, more of a pop sound than a funk sound, but great, great, great. Everyday People, Sly and the Family Stone. Give a listen. Everyday People, Sly and the Family Stone. Now, Sly and the Family Stone, the kind of music they played, it was funk music. And funk music, I think we talked about when we were together in class. Maybe we didn't, and I was just talking to myself. Funk music came along in, or at least became sort of fused together as a form in the mid 60s. And it was popular, or it started its popularity in African American communities. It was a hybrid, as a lot of music is. It took elements from jazz, it took elements from more pure rhythm and blues. And funk music, in some ways, was the forefather of disco, but in other ways, not. But funk music, it wasn't as it didn't think of itself in terms of melody. It thought of itself in terms of the bass line. It thought of itself in terms of the rhythm behind it. The not so much the steadiness of the beat. That's where disco took it on, but that driving bass line, bump, 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 bump. That the driving bass line behind whatever song was going on. Coffee. Now sentences will form. Um, so, funk music. Strong bass line, not necessarily so much about the melody, although there was melody, but it was really about that sort of driving rhythm behind it. It was danceable, and it was intended to be danceable. Thank you for letting me be myself again. And if you look at the phonetic spelling, it is spelled as thank you for letting me be myself again. But it's thank you for letting me be myself again. Sly and the Family Stone, another number one record. This, however, give it a listen. This is funk music at its best. Great song. Sly and the Family Stone, thank you for letting me be myself again. All right. A song that came around in the late 60s that was a hugely popular record was called I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And I'm playing it for you in part, or you're going to play it for yourself in part, because it was popularized by some very different bands and some very different versions. The first version that came down was done by Gladys Knight and the Pips. It went all the way to number 2 on the pop chart. It was a hugely successful version. This is when Gladys Knight and the Pips were still with Motown. We'll talk. And give a spin to I Heard It Through the Grapevine by Gladys Knight and the Pips. Gladys could sing, man. Whew. 9 months later, Marvin Gaye released his version, also in the Motown family of labels. It was a very different song, but Marvin Gaye's version surpassed Gladys's version in terms of popularity. Even though Gladys and the Pips went to number 2, Marvin Gaye went all the way to number 1, stayed at number 1 for a couple months with the version of I Heard It Through the Grapevine that I think most people will agree is the definitive version. Give a listen to Marvin Gaye. All right, I keep forgetting that you can't hear the music, so I'm just listening to it and. Okay. Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR, we've already talked about them. Great Southern roots band. And they did a version of I Heard It Through the Grapevine as well that came out a little bit later, but late 60s. Very faithful to the Marvin Gaye rendition. Listen to Creedence Clearwater. John Fogerty, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and their version of I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Obviously, a great song. 3 versions that came out within a couple years of one another, and all of which were hits, and all of which could stand on their own. All right, we're in the late 60s now, 68, 69. All the great music that comes down. Again, this just goes to show the number 1 record of 1969 was actually by comic book characters. The Archies was a comic book that had been developed or was developed into a Saturday morning cartoon show. And as in the tradition of the Monkees, although the Monkees were a prefabricated group that could actually perform, other groups were developed at this time that were not 100%. I was about to say 100% legit. That's not true. They were legitimate. It's just you had to change the boundaries of what legitimate meant. The fact of the matter is you had studio musicians singing the songs, and they didn't have a face to the public. The face to the public was cartoon characters, or as would come later, members of the Partridge Family. So in the case of the Archies, it was a bunch of cartoons singing the song, and the song was called Sugar Sugar, and it would go on to be the biggest hit record of 1969. Give a listen. Another of the biggest hits of 69, the Stones were still on the map with Honky Tonk Women. Great song. I hope you're listening to Spotify, man, because this is a great song. Great song to have with coffee. All right, Mick, Keith, the Rolling Stones, Honky Tonk Women, one of the classics, absolutely. Okay, there was there's always these, little burps in rock and roll that come along where for 9 months or a year and a half or 4 years, you have this offshoot of the mainstream of rock music that kind of takes over the airwaves. And late 60s and early 70s, there was a thing called jazz rock. And jazz rock was where you had rock and roll music, but you also had the incorporation of musical instruments that were more predominantly known in the jazz arena. Saxophone, of course, although saxophone was always a member of the rock and roll family, but saxophone, trumpet, trombone, flute, clarinet, a little bit less, but you have this sort of jazz influence, not just in terms of the instruments used, but in terms of the vocals, in terms of the musical background. The two main acts that fueled the jazz rock movement in 69, 70, 71 were a band called Blood, Sweat, and Tears and another band that you may have heard of called Chicago. And Chicago would go on to have some different iterations, but they were very much a jazz rock band at the beginning of their career. And Blood, Sweat, and Tears kind of came and went, live and died on the jazz rock style. So give a listen. You Made Me So Very Happy. Tears. You Made Me So Very Happy, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, jazz rock. A great little burp in rock and roll history. Again, kind of came and went for a time in the 69, 70. And the other song I want you to be aware of, Johnny Cash came around, and we know Johnny from other days, but the biggest hit he ever had on the pop chart was with this novelty record called A Boy Named Sue. And finally, Neil Diamond, Sweet Caroline, entered into the 1970s. Neil Diamond, one of the great songwriters from where? Yes, thank you. The Brill Building. And Sweet Caroline, one of his biggest hits. Bah, bah, bah. Listen. Okay, and that's going to wrap up this one. I'll see you on the other side.